take in what the weather and climate system looks like today, and then these models have been trained to simulate individual possibilities of what can happen in the future.
We have a suite of products now that cater to different forecast timelines or horizons, and that's very different in the industry, and it's something that is fairly unique to what we're doing.
I can tell you this, with the ability that these AI models and Ben's group are bringing, we were able to improve our forecast skill maybe out in the extended, maybe 6 to 12 hours of improved forecast range every 5 to 10 years.
All right, welcome back to the Middle Tech Podcast. My name is Logan Jones. Today I'm here alone. Evan is on family vacation camping up in Michigan, but I'm up here in Louisville to record another episode with Climavision. So we are sitting down with Chris Goode, who is the founder and CEO, but we're also joined by Ben Toms, who is the VP of AI Weather, and Peter Childs, who is the Chief Scientist at Climavision. Last time you heard from Chris was back in November of 2021, just a few months after Climavision had come out of stealth mode, announcing that they had raised $100 million. Since then, Climavision has continued to grow, building out their infrastructure and announcing the acquisition of Intersphere, which is where Ben comes into the picture here. What really stuck with me from that first episode though was just the importance of weather data and how widely used it is. So excited to be revisiting Climavision and hear the progress that they've made since we last had Chris on. Before we dive into this episode, let's just get a quick word from our sponsors. Before highlighting our sponsors, we'd just like to state that the views and content shared on this platform do not necessarily reflect those of our show sponsors. Middle Tech is presented by KY Innovation, the Kentucky Cabinet for Economic Development's Office of Entrepreneurship. KY Innovation exists to support and develop Kentucky's startup ecosystem, and we are proud to be supported by an organization whose mission aligns so closely with ours. If you're a founder building in Kentucky, you need to check out the resources that KY Innovation has to offer. You can find more information by clicking the link in our show notes or going to kyinnovation.com. Middle Tech is sponsored by Bolt Marketing. Take your website to the next level with a website that's built to work. At Bolt Marketing, they're revolutionizing websites for small businesses that are affordable, customizable, and hassle-free. Whether you have a construction company, a boutique clothing store, or you own a hot yoga studio, they have options for you. Click the link in our show notes to explore their marketing options that can transform your marketing and grow your business. And as a personal note, Bolt Marketing built our website, and they were awesome to work with throughout the entire process. We highly recommend working with them. Middle Tech is also supported by Huntsicker, an impact venture studio based in Lexington, Kentucky. Huntsicker is creating companies out of the ordinary by founding and funding the next generation of purpose-driven startups. They partner with founders to create indispensable solutions to the world's most fundamental problems. On a quarterly basis, they host an invite-only intimate gathering called Fireside Convos, where attendees representing a wide network of stakeholders in the regional entrepreneurial ecosystem discuss timely topics, including the role of AI for startups out of Kentucky and the challenges of identifying and attracting talent. To be considered as a guest, visit huntsicker.co/fireside to apply. All right, Chris, welcome back onto the Middle Tech Podcast. We're thrilled to have you back on here, and we are now joined by Ben and Peter on your team as well. So super excited to be talking about how you guys have grown over the past few years. Thanks for making the time.
You bet. It's really good to be here, and time flies. It's hard to believe that it was November of 21. But yeah, I'm really excited to sit down with you because, of course, a lot has changed over the past couple of years. And it's great to have Ben and Pete here as well, because a lot of what we are doing, of course, pivots around both of them and their leadership and, of course, their respective teams.
Yeah, and I'm excited to dive into both of your all's backgrounds. I did some research on LinkedIn and was looking into what you guys have done. You both have very impressive backgrounds. So, Peter, I just want to start off with your background. Again, you're the chief scientist here at Climavision. So let's just start by talking about what that role actually entails. What does the chief scientist do at this company?
Yeah, I appreciate you guys coming out. Chief scientists were, involved in kind of all aspects of the business, from this data capture we're doing with this proprietary radar network we're deploying all over the country, to quality control, all the way to the forecasting process for specific weather sensitive industries, whether those are in aviation or energy space, and kind of all those pieces in between.
And you have a pretty impressive background that makes you what looks like the perfect fit for a chief scientist. So I was looking through, you had a master's in atmospheric science and meteorology. You served as a meteorologist and forecaster, and most recently the chief scientist at Priogen Energy. I wanted to talk about Priogen just because I thought that one was interesting. Talk about what Priogen did in terms of working in the gas and energy markets.
Yeah, so Priogen is a portfolio optimization business, which really means we're just trying to maximize the ability of these various asset owners, whether those are gas producers, natural gas producers, wind energy producers, solar producers, helping them optimize their portfolios. So, make sure that they're generating most optimally power from those various types of power sources. And we had in our team at Priogen, the science team, we had about 15 scientists there working on everything from data capture to pre-processing to helping come up with actual price forecasts, which is so important in optimization.
Yeah, I feel like that's stuff that goes on behind the scenes that none of us really understand or pay attention to, but it's so critical to to our energy infrastructure at the end of the day.
You're 100%. I mean, especially with the energy transition that's happening now as you're going from more traditional thermal-based energy. Think of your coal plants, your gas plants, your nuclear plants, into more what we call, variable renewables, wind, solar, hydro now, which are directly impacted both from a demand perspective, but also a generation perspective. And so the impact of weather in this space just continues to grow.
Yep, for sure. And then Chris, you were mentioning that you guys actually worked at the same company together prior to him joining Climavision. So what was that company? And tell us a little bit about getting to work with Peter.
We did. We had a couple of years where we overlapped at a company called AirDat. And that company was actually subsequently acquired by Panasonic Aviation. But it was an important part of our shared history because at AirDat, Pete and his team developed new ways of assimilating aircraft observed data. We built a network there by placing instrumentation on commercial aircraft that replicated the data that you would get from weather balloons, essentially. And in its own way was a gap-filling play. It was gap-filling a different type of data. Whereas here at Climavision, we're gap-filling radars organically. At AirDat, we were gap-filling upper air data with these commercial aircraft observations. But it was a really important period. And partly we're applying that experience to what we're doing at Climavision because Pete and his team there developed novel ways of assimilating this new data set and blending it with the existing public data. So we're carrying on that tradition, if you will.
Very interesting. I remember one of the things that I took away from the last time we recorded with you as well was how suited your background was to be doing what you're doing now. So it makes a ton of sense just how you've gone about building this team, past relationships at past businesses. And I'm sure you're just very well networked throughout the entire industry.
I've been really lucky to work with some great people with great talents and certainly wanted to apply that network and experience at Climavision. And of course, we've got some new blood on the team as well, which I'll let you explore.
Absolutely. Yeah, Ben. So welcome to the Climavision team. I guess it's not as new anymore. That was back in April, I believe.
It's been 3 months now.
The acquisition went through. I guess just to frame things here. So we said that Climavision made an acquisition. That was the acquisition of your company, Intersphere. So I want to talk about your background too. I was joking before we hit record on this that it was like Climavision made you in a lab because your background was just so cut out for what you're doing now. And I was really impressed how your background kind of led. Your education went straight into a startup, and then the startup was acquired by Climavision. It's an impressive thing. It's a rare thing. So one, congrats on that. But two, just talk us through your educational background. So I know you started off with a bachelor in meteorology, but I'll let you kind of take it from there and fill us in on what you did.
Yeah. So in undergrad, I got degrees in meteorology and civil engineering. And so, I mean, meteorology is very objective. Typically, it's based on physical equations. Whereas civil engineering is more based on estimated parameters from observations. And so it's hard to quantify a lot of the things that they build. And so from that combined background, I got more interested in statistical modeling of weather and climate. So then I went to graduate school and I focused on some of the physics-based models that Pete and his team build out. But I ultimately got really interested in machine learning when the big surge in AI happened, with typical vision models that people were applying to like identifying animals. So then partway through grad school, I switched my focus from the physics-based models to the AI-based models. So I've been working on that since about 2017, and I was funded by the Department of Energy. I went to them and asked for money for graduate school in this program. And so they funded me to work on AI. So, I mean, that was cool. I got to work with a really smart advisor at Colorado State. And then, yeah, I got my PhD and then started the company after that.
And did you know that you wanted to start a company, or was this just something that you're like, I feel like I've discovered something and why not start a company? Like, how did that part come to be? Have you always aspired to be an entrepreneur?
No, I mean, I started a company because I was interested in topics that were more applied than academia. So getting to the actual end goal of selling something to somebody. And they were a little bit too high risk for a lot of corporations to take on. So it was a very conscious decision of like, I want to work on these problems and a startup has to do it. And so then I stepped into it for that reason.
And just to linger on Intersphere for just a bit longer, talk about the problem that you had identified for that company and how you set about to solve it.
Yeah, so like I was talking about, it was in this middle ground between where academia would solve it and where corporations would. And so that problem was really this longer range forecasting idea of if you can forecast beyond 2 weeks, out to a few years potentially, then that can help people just plan for their energy, natural resource management, like Pete was talking about. And so, yeah, I mean, that was the idea behind the technology. There's some issues with physics-based models for issuing forecasts that far out. AI had the potential to be really cheap computationally, so a small business could do it. So that's why I took the AI approach for that.
Very interesting. I'm excited we have a section of this conversation where we'll dive into the differences between the physics-based modeling and generative AI modeling. It sounds like something that is it's a great time to be working on it with everything going on in the space right now. So we'll come back to that. But Chris, catch us up on what's been going on at Climavision over the past 3 years. It's been all sorts of stuff. Obviously we just talked about the acquisition there. Would love to hear about that from your perspective and, why that made sense for Climavision. There's a few other points I want to hit on as well.
Sure. Yeah, it's been an exciting 2 years since we last sat down. And I think as we unpacked before in our initial conversation, Climavision is multifaceted. One of the primary things that we're doing relates to deploying a supplemental radar network to augment the existing government NexRad network, as it's called here in the U.S., that's operated by NOAA and the National Weather Service. Great network, but there are blind spots, and we're focused on filling those blind spots. So happy to relay that we're up to 27 systems that have been deployed across the country in 17 different states, 2 of which are here in Kentucky. We've effectively filled a gap that extends from Covington all the way down to the Tennessee border along the I-75 transportation corridor. So we're filling in that very nicely. And one of the big milestones as it relates to the radar network is that we secured a contract with NOAA and the National Weather Service in September of 2023 to deliver a subset of the radars that we've deployed to their forecast offices that are regionally based around the country.
So when you say a subset of those radars, can you just elaborate on that a little bit more for our listeners?
The subset meaning that not all 27 are flowing now into the government. What we're doing is working on expanding that contract in fiscal year 2025 so that more offices and more radars can be delivered to help with this gap-filling mission that we've undertaken.
Very cool. And talk about your go-to-market strategy too. So you guys have just brought on a new VP of Global Sales. That's typically one of the most difficult parts of starting a company is scaling up revenue and getting it to a point where the business is sustainable. Talk about that whole go-to-market sales motion and what it meant to bring on a VP of Global Sales.
Well, sure. I would say that as it relates to the go-to-market strategy, what we've primarily done to this point beyond the government sales of radars and also opening up some channels through media where local television stations can leverage the radar data. The bigger part of the makeup of our go-to strategy has been the word that we'll discuss a lot today, and that is energy. The biggest mix of our revenue to date comes through the energy market for obvious reasons. There's so much focus on it. Pete alluded to the fact that the energy transition is driving additional appetite for better information around characterizing both the demand for energy through weather that often comes through weather, but also the consumption of energy and the availability of renewable sources that, again, are often derived from weather. So that's been a big tailwind for us. The other thing is you've got a lot of capital that's flowing into the sector, given the Inflation Reduction Act that's been instituted. So there's a lot of interest for good reason. And the go-to-market strategy is built around servicing companies and entities that are in that particular ecosystem.
It makes a lot of sense, especially when you, like Pete was saying, thinking of transitioning to more of these renewable energy sources that are a little bit more intermittent. When you think of things like wind or solar, not having the sunshine all day or the wind blow all the time, it seems like your all's data would be essential to be able to control the grid effectively, and being able to have that data fed in to be able to tell, do we need to have peaker plants brought on? Do we need to be, bringing other energy sources onto the grid at different times? I would imagine that you almost couldn't run the grid without that constant inflow of data.
You can, but not effectively.
Right. Yeah.
And you run the risk of serious situations that can develop, like, for instance, in Texas.
Right.
A couple of years ago, we had a pretty severe winter storm event that moved through there and nearly brought that to its knees. And so planning for the intermittency and the impact of these types of weather systems is becoming more and more prevalent, especially as the ratio and the mix of energy starts to lean more in the renewables direction.
Yep. And so to touch on the acquisition of Intersphere for just a little bit longer here, so talk about what that adds to Climavision's sort of offering to your all's clients. Like, where does the value of that acquisition really show through for Climavision?
Well, one of the biggest changes since we last sat down a couple of years ago has been the impact of AI on our industry. I'd say that starting in September of last year, it really started to raise its profile. There were a number of things done by a number of different players in the industry that showed the utility and the effectiveness of AI, generative AI specifically in weather modeling. And that's only snowballed since then. So for us, and I'm going to let these gentlemen unpack this further, but for us, with Pete and his team and our traditional physics-based approach to modeling, we were focused on a 15-day forecast. But through the acquisition of what Ben built at Intersphere and now bringing that into Climavision, we now have the ability not to only focus on those 15 days, but going out to 2 years. And that's becoming more and more important in energy because of companies and entities that are interested in grid balancing and so forth, wanting to understand at a longer term or a longer horizon for a forecast what the availability of these different sources from energy, what they'll look like over those periods. So it's become very important for us, and it's certainly a critical part for us to have a two-prong approach to modeling that includes traditional physics-based modeling as well as generative AI that Ben and his team brought to the table.
Yeah, I'm excited to dig into that. One more question before we do, though, just Climavision. So over the past 3 years now, you've been focused on building out the infrastructure. You made this acquisition. You're getting the revenue team built out. What's the focus over the next 3 to 5 years? Where do you kind of see the company strategically looking over the short term?
Well, I'd say for sure, and over the next couple of years, the emphasis will continue to be on the energy marketplace and developing solutions that cater to the various players, whether that's an energy commodities trader, whether that's somebody that's tasked with grid optimization and making sure that the balance of energy as an input to those grids is fully understood and characterized. And then, of course, completing the execution of the network rollout and expanding our opportunities there in the government space as well.
Very cool. All right, let's get into this conversation around generative AI modeling versus this physics-based modeling. So Ben, Peter, I'd like to just get an overview of these two different methods of modeling the weather here. So Ben, we'll start with you. How, for an audience that might not be super versed in weather modeling, how would you describe generative AI weather prediction?
Yeah, so generative AI weather prediction actually works in concept pretty similar to the types of models that Pete's team builds with physics-based models, where the objective is to create a bunch of different possibilities of what can happen in the future in the weather and climate system. So Yeah, I mean, you take in what the weather and climate system looks like today, and then these models have been trained to simulate individual possibilities of what can happen in the future.
So would it be, if I'm comparing it to a large language model and I'm feeding in tons of data to a large language model and it's being able to spit out, using statistical inference to give me sentences and talk like a human, is it similar in that way as you're feeding a ton of weather data into it and then it's able to find the different ways that the different systems interact with each other? Is that?
Yeah, you can think of it pretty similarly. And so the types of AI models that these LLMs use, they're actually really similar to the types of models that we use in weather and climate forecasting. And so one of the reasons for that is, like, in AI, they're trying to make these general types of algorithms that work with a bunch of different types of data. So the models are actually fairly conceptually similar.
Interesting. And physics-based modeling, talk about how that works. I know it's based on the laws of physics, if I'm not mistaken, and how fluids flow throughout the atmosphere. It's about as far as my knowledge is going to take us. Talk about how that actually works and what's going on behind the scenes there.
Yeah, so like Ben was saying, we try to do with traditional physics modeling is we actually start with observations. So observations both at, say, the surface, observations from we talked about aircraft, Chris did, a lot of space-based observations as well. And those kind of give us a snapshot, right, of what's happening in various locations on all across the Earth. They're still incomplete, though, and we don't have observations from every location, so we need to kind of fill that information in. And we do that through these physics-based approaches, as you say, where we take these known laws of really fluid mechanics, and we apply those and kind of combine those with observations to give us an estimate of what the atmosphere is looking like, let's say, right outside now. And with that information, we then use that as a starting point, an analysis we call it, to then start our forecast, of which we run these compute-intensive physics models out, depending on the use, at 1 day, 2 days, 5 days, or 10 days, and produce various outcomes of temperature, humidity, hurricane tracks, for example, from that approach.
It sounds like that'd be a pretty big computational lift to take into account all of those different inputs that I assume are going into those equations. Is it comparable to the generative AI modeling in terms of the amount of compute that it takes, or is one more efficient than the other?
Yeah, I mean, so I can let Ben can speak to, like, there's different components. There's a training piece, which I think obviously Ben's much more experienced talking to in the AI side. For us, it's very compute intensive, and the most compute intensive part for us is actually kind of combining all those observations that are gathered globally in real time with what we call this information that's coming from these physical models, combining those into this analysis. That's the most computationally expensive part for us. And it runs on thousands and thousands of computer processors. And once we have that, we then run the actual forecasting model that'll tell us what's the weather going to be in Louisville 3, 4, 5 days from now.
Interesting. And I want to get into how accurate we can actually get with weather forecasting from a scientific perspective on it, a statistical perspective on it. But before that, so for each method here, you're collecting a bunch of data about the atmosphere and about the weather and what's going on in the atmosphere. Where does that data come from? I assume it's coming from your all's assets that you own, but give us a sense of how the different methods are being collected.
So we process on a daily basis about 1.5 billion observations. Some of those, as you mentioned, come from the radars that we're deploying. Some of those observations come from governments like the ones that we have here in the U.S. with NOAA and the National Weather Service, but other members of the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization. All of that data, that public data, all companies have access to. But one of the things that we set out to do with Climavision is add to that observational data set that is provisioned by various governments. And that's what we're doing with our radars, but we also have different partnerships where we bring in other types of data. We work with a company called Windborne out on the West Coast who has deployed a network, a scaling network, just like the one we're building, where they have balloons that are launched, but those balloons are called long endurance balloons, and they can actually navigate those through the atmosphere to collect information, much like a typical weather balloon, but over longer durations. So they can ascend and descend through the atmosphere multiple times. And they're in areas where the existing network is not launched. So for instance, we're in the tropical season now. You hear about hurricanes on a week-to-week basis. They're launching balloons off the west coast of Africa in Cabo Verde, and in other places that will inform the tracks and the intensities of these storms that are developing now through October, so that we add those observations into our physics-based modeling to create more fidelity around the forecast in that regard. And then we pull in other data from other players as well. And we're uniquely positioned to do that because of our approach to data assimilation and being on the front end of a long value chain, which Pete can talk more about. But that's part of what was pioneered through our shared experience at AirDat.
Interesting. And so would you say that one of these methods is better than the other? It sounds like the physics-based modeling is maybe better for doing shorter forecasting, and then the generative AI is longer term. How do you guys think of that aspect of it?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, it's not that one is better than the other. They just offer different types of information. So,
gotcha.
And really quickly to get back to something that Pete was talking about, a key thing with the AI-based models is you can train your model on a bunch of data, but then you still need accurate representations of the weather and climate system now to issue the forecast. So all those observations and physical equations that are used to initialize the physics-based models, we also have to use that to initialize the AI models. So like on Pete's team, a lot of the compute they use has to go into synthesizing all that information. So we still have to use all of those observations and physics to create the AI-based forecast. So they're not entirely decoupled at this point.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. So in a way, the physics-based modeling is an input into the AI system.
Yeah. So they're still very coupled at this point.
Interesting. Okay. So in terms of Climavision, what does it mean to be able to have a team that's able to have expertise in both of those fields? I mean, I'm sure it provides a much broader way to serve your clients, but in a more technical sense, talk about what that means.
It means everything, because now we can be very strategic and surgical about which solution fits the right use case. Mm-hmm. We have a suite of products now that cater to different forecast timelines or horizons. And that's very different in the industry. And it's something that is fairly unique to what we're doing.
And I'm thinking more about like the future of this and where this can go as these models get better and as you're able to feed more data into the generative AI models. And I assume that the physics-based modeling is relatively unchanged. Or does that typically, or is there new science that comes about from that?
We call it the quiet revolution. It's not changing quite as quickly as some of the AI stuff, but it's constantly being developed. New types of numerics approximations. We have a lot of approximations. So a lot of the ways that these physical models work, we have to approximate certain things. Let's say as the sun hits the earth, how that energy gets either absorbed or transferred up in the atmosphere. These are approximations we make. And in those approximations, there are, it's more of an art than a science at times. So one of the interesting things that I'm looking forward to doing and working with Ben is some of these AI might be able to help us uncover better parameterizations or characterizations than we're able to do just with the standard way we've been developing physical models, for example. So they're very, very complementary to each other. And that's one of, I think, the real benefits we have is we can start from raw observations, create all these initial conditions, and then through both our physical models and our AI models, be able to really characterize the types of probabilities that these various high impact weather events might have, which is really what a lot of our sophisticated clients are looking for now. They're very complementary approaches.
Yeah, that was kind of in line with the next question on my mind, which is just how accurate can weather forecasting and weather modeling reasonably get? Like, obviously, we're not going to be able to know with certainty, I wouldn't imagine at any point, but how close can we get to certainty using these methods?
I mean, that's,
I'm sure that's a big question.
That's a huge question.
Yeah.
I mean, I can tell you this, with the ability that these AI models and Ben's group are bringing, we were able to improve our forecast skill, maybe out in the extended, maybe 6 to 12 hours of improved forecast range every 5 to 10 years. So in other words, 5.5 days. It would take us 5 to 10 years to get to 6 days of, let's say, improved skill. We're going to be able to do that a lot more quickly with these AI models and the abilities that folks like Ben are bringing. I can say that for sure.
And what are the downstream effects of that as you move towards, being able to be more accurate around those types of predictions? I know we talked a lot about the energy industry. I'm sure there's a lot of downstream effects of that, but where does your mind go when you think of being able to continue to advance this modeling?
I mean, we talked a lot about energy. There's aviation as well. Aviation, as there are more and more flights, larger and larger aircraft, trying to manage at these various airports, getting those planes more tightly packed, coming in both vertically packed as they fly across the country and coming in and out more quickly at airports. You need highly accurate weather information to do that. Optimizations for fuel optimization. We've talked a lot about green energy, but also fuel optimization in aviation is really important. And so a lot of times what they'll do now is if they can get right trajectories to, let's say, fly from Washington, D.C. to London, they want to put in specific waypoints where they can actually begin to power down some of these engines, save 50 or 100 kilograms of fuel per flight. That adds up to a lot of CO2 less in the atmosphere, and even more importantly from the airline side, billions of dollars over each year. So there's a lot of places where these kinds of enhancements we're bringing are going to be really realized.
That's super interesting. Well, before we wrap up the section around generative AI modeling and physics-based modeling, is there anything that I'm not understanding as somebody that is new to this that you feel like would be interesting for the audience to hear? Are there any parts we haven't hit on? Anything you want to add to that part of the conversation before moving on?
I mean, for AI, one of the big benefits is it is fairly computationally cheap to actually issue the forecast. So we have to issue the forecast using the physics-based and observations, physics-based models and observations that Pete was talking about. But when you actually make a forecast, issuing that forecast is very cheap. So one thing that you can do is you can issue these different possibilities of what can happen, and you can issue a lot more of them. And so you can quantify uncertainty of the future and weather climate state potentially a lot easier than a physics-based model. And that still isn't entirely clear. There's a lot of research going into that right now, but that is a possibility.
And so just to kind of materialize that in the audience's head, what does that actually look like? Does that mean like if I go to my weather app and it says here are the different weather patterns that could occur in a particular day and here's the probability of them, or what is that like? How can we kind of materialize that?
Yeah, so for typical consumers, like AI probably won't change too much about what they do. What we're thinking about here is uncertainty for people that have really high value assets that extreme weather can impact. So, I mean, people that are transacting a lot of money, like on the energy system, where these extremes of like, if a thunderstorm impacts a city, it can plummet energy demand really quickly. So if you can understand that uncertainty a lot better, that's helpful. Or even potentially something like hurricanes, like if you can understand hurricane paths, the entire spread of possible outcomes of like where a hurricane is going to impact in the Gulf of Mexico, that's a big deal too.
And also, make no mistake, while we are focused on energy because there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of return on the investment in that particular space, verticals like insurance, this is very important. You just look at the state of the insurance industry, and it's in a very fragile state depending on certain geographies, right? It's difficult to actually get insurance in Florida right now. Why? Because of the weather. Also, you look out west, it's becoming increasingly problematic. Wildfires and things like this that have been problems that have been there for a long time, right? But they've been somewhat exacerbated by changing climate. So the frequencies of these events has gone up. And it's really challenging that industry. And in insurance industry specifically, that's an industry that has relied on history to inform the future. Well, when you have a changing climate, it's very difficult to rely on that history because you've got to factor in things that haven't been realized before and the speed of change that we're witnessing. So that's another market. And then, of course, agriculture as well. These seasonal, sub-seasonal forecasts that Ben has developed with his team, they're not new unto themselves, but what's new is the ability to create confidence around the accuracies of these forecasts. That's something that's changed a lot. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that because you guys have done a lot of work, both prior to acquisition and even post-acquisition to improve accuracy.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the advantages to AI is that typical physics-based models, like Pete was talking about, they have these specific assumptions around the physics that go into them, right? And so each model has its own selection of the types of physics that it uses to make a forecast. But AI can integrate a few different types of these models to, say like, okay, maybe we have 10 different possibilities of the physics that we can use, and it learns from the weather and climate patterns from each of those separate models. So then you can potentially get a more accurate forecast or quantify uncertainty better too. So when we're thinking about like the accuracy side, another really cool thing about AI models is, it's easy to issue forecasts. But once you train an AI model, you can also go in the past and say, if I had issued a forecast, what would that forecast have looked like? And so they do this with physics-based models a lot too. But with the AI models, it's really cheap to do that. So then when you train a model, you can quantify the accuracy much easier because you can say like every single day in the past, issue a make-believe forecast and see how accurate it would have been. And then you can synthesize that.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I can, because that seems like that would be really effective at helping improve the accuracy of the model. If you're able to train it and say, here's how accurate you were in the past compared to the real data that was collected about that forecast. That seems like that'd be very valuable training data.
Yeah, it is really valuable training data. I mean, this exact same thing is done with physics-based models too. So this concept is not new to AI models.
Sure.
And so like operational numerical weather prediction centers do this all the time. So NOAA and ECMWF, which is partially the European counterpart to what NOAA does, they do this entire thing too. So I mean, AI models, we take a similar approach to what they're doing. But yeah, you're right.
Very cool. Well, guys, I do love digging into the technical aspects of stuff like this, and I feel like I've truly learned something new in this episode. So appreciate you guys educating me through this. Ben, congrats on the acquisition and joining the Climavision team. It's super exciting, and especially at a young age like yours. So that's awesome. Before we let you guys go, if anybody's listening that might want to be a client of Climavision, or at least just follow along with what you guys are doing, where can they find more information about you guys?
Easiest way is climavision.com. A lot of different ways to interact with us there. And a lot of new things to look at on the website if you haven't visited recently. There's not only what we're doing with Ben and his team, but a lot of news about where we're deploying radars and building out that network, which is extremely important as well.
Absolutely. I was doing a lot of research on it last night, and it looks great. Looks great. All right. Thanks so much, guys. This was an awesome conversation.
You got it. Great to be with you.